Good morning, gentlemen. Today's lesson is on emotive language. So what exactly is emotive language? Well, emotive language is language which arouses or is likely to arouse strong feelings or emotions, usually by expressing the writer's or speaker's approval or disapproval of a person, a group of people, or an activity. Some might refer to this as tugging at people's heartstrings. The emotions aroused by such language can be both positive and negative. Now, an example of this would be someone who disapproves of the death penalty. This person may call it murderous, or they may call it cruel and inhumane punishment. Just as a side note, it's interesting that in South Africa, the death penalty was declared illegal by the Constitutional Court, which is the highest court of the land rather. This happened in the 90s, and the reason for doing so was because, and I quote, "it amounts to cruel and inhumane punishment." This is the same reason that was given for declaring corporal punishment, also known as the spanking of children, illegal in South Africa. So already we begin to note that even within our law we find emotive language. It is difficult to find any piece of writing or conversation that does not involve emotive language. Maybe this is because we are emotional beings who are driven by our emotional responses to the things around us. Maybe that is why even when we write laws, which are meant to be these neutral, unbiased pieces of writing, which are meant to be detached from emotion, yet still we find ourselves using emotive language. So at face value, on the face of it, it appears that we cannot avoid emotive language. It seems to be part of the fabric that makes up our society. Speaking of South Africa and speaking of the 90s, the late Honorable President Nelson Mandela was declared a terrorist by the apartheid government. Today, he is famously known as one of the greatest freedom fighters to have ever lived, and he even won a Nobel Peace Prize for being a peacemaker. Now, how can one person be both an international terrorist and at the same time be one of the most famous peacemakers in the modern world? This is clearly an example of how one description shows strong disapproval of his actions, and obviously that description is terrorist, while the other shows strong approval of his actions, and that description is, of course, freedom fighter. The choice of description depends on which emotional response you wish to arouse in your audience. In other words, your intention influences your choice of words when you use emotive language. Now, speaking of intention, if your intention is to persuade your mother to give you money to go and watch, and I quote, "a movie that you are dying to see," you deliberately use the words that help you to tug at your mom's heartstrings. You may also ask your dad to buy you that Xbox or PlayStation game that you just absolutely have to have. Now, of course, some of you are already thinking as I say this, the success of your emotive language in arousing an emotional response also depends at times largely on your audience. Some moms in this audience may be moved by the emotive language, while others may remain unmoved. And this is why you have to write or speak with your audience in mind. One piece of emotive language may work for one audience and may not work for another audience. Now let's go and look at some real life examples of emotive language. Now, generally, emotive language, especially in the news, is designed to tell you the facts, but wait for it, while influencing you to adopt the author's opinion. And here are examples of emotive language that we can find in the news. Now, let me start with a non-emotive version. Another person in the bar was injured by the man's glass. It's pretty straightforward to see that there isn't much emotion here. It's just a statement of fact. There was another person in the bar who was injured by the man's glass. Now, if we look at the emotive version, it would go something like this. An innocent bystander suffered facial injuries when the thug launched his glass across the bar. Same facts, different choice of words, depending on your intention and the emotional response you wish to arouse from your audience. Let's look at a different set of circumstances. Again, I'll start with the non-emotive version. The government will reduce interest rates. Once again, statement of facts, government's dropping interest rates. Hopefully some of you guys will end up in business studies and we can have further chats about interest rates there. And hopefully you've begun having chats about interest rates and EMS. Anyways, I'm drifting badly. So that was the non-emotive version. Now the emotive version. The government will slash interest rates. Once again, similar set of facts but different delivery. Now the choice of the word slash obviously implies that interest rates are going to change significantly and they're going to be reduced by a large amount, which may or may not be true depending on the circumstances. But clearly it will evoke a different emotional response from the audience. And one last one before we move on. Let's have let's see, something cool. Here's the non-emotive version of my final example. Mr. Ngema was attacked by his neighbor for 2 minutes. Once again, statement of fact. His neighbor attacked him and the attack lasted 2 minutes. Let's have a look at the emotive version. For what seemed like a lifetime, Mr. Ngema was subjected to a vicious, cowardly assault by the unemployed, steroid-pumped monster. Once again, there's a clear intention to vilify Mr. Ngema's attacker in the second speech. And that's obviously done deliberately to, once again, evoke a particular emotional response. Now, the question is, why should you care about emotive language? And generally, there are two broad reasons why we should all care about emotive language. And the first reason is that being able to understand and use emotive language can help us to influence others. When using emotive language, there's an opportunity to influence your reader's opinion. Excuse me. Let's have a look at a sentence. I could either say that Kobe begged, asked, or pestered passers-by for help. Now, when I pick my word, I will pick the one that suits my needs or objectives or my intentions. Which heartstrings do I want to pull at and which emotional response am I trying to evoke? Do you want your readers to like Kobe? Well, then if you do, then using the word pestered will not be a good choice because, generally speaking, the implied meaning of the word pester includes to annoy or harass. And if you're painting Kobe as someone who annoys or harasses people, already people have a negative image of Kobe. Now there's a disclaimer here, especially there's a disclaimer. You must bear in mind that your choice of words can expose your leanings, or what we also know as biases, which is why sometimes it may be useful to use subtle emotive language, which can be more effective because you can portray yourself as someone who's just giving facts when actually you are using very subtle emotive language to sway the audience in a particular path. Subtle emotive language is best created by using a thesaurus to find synonyms. What's a synonym? Just a refresher. These are terms that mean the same or have nearly the same meaning as another term. It is often the connotation, also known as the more nuanced meaning of the word, that provides the appropriate level of emotiveness. In a moment, I'll deal a bit more in depth with the meaning of connotation, but for now, let's just focus on emotive language. And here's an example. The flames barely illuminated Rihanna's slim or willowy or skinny figure. Once again, you need to pick the word that suits your needs or your desired outcome. Which emotions are you trying to get from your audience? Now, in this case, slim and skinny create a positive, slim creates a positive impression, while the word skinny creates a negative impression. However, the word willowy creates a generally negative impression, but it doesn't expose the author's dislike or contempt for Rihanna as evidently as skinny does. So that's just one way you can be a bit more subtle. And obviously, for those of you who'll end up either in media or end up as a lobbyist or someone who needs to persuade people, you will get to learn more about just trying to find that balance between finding a word that either paints someone in a good light or a bad light without exposing your own predispositions or biases, and makes you seem like a neutral storyteller when actually you are loading your words with connotations and implied meanings and suggestions. The second reason is that you need to be aware of emotive language so that you are not influenced by others. Spotting emotive language is also useful from a reader's perspective. If an author describes rugby as a brutal sport that sends young boys to emergency rooms by the thousands every weekend, or an SUV as an enormous gas guzzler, you are probably not reading an unbiased article. It is pretty clear from the choice of words and the emotive language that the author has a particular bias and is probably pushing a certain agenda. You don't want to fall victim to agendas. It is important now more so than ever before that you are able to spot fake news. And one of the most obvious hints or suggestions that what you are watching is fake news is the gross use of emotive language.